Okay, welcome to another episode of Belong in HE. My name's Nathan, and I just want to say a big hello to all previous listeners and to all new listeners. This episode is really exciting. I've got guests Dr. Barbara Adewumi and Alex Hensby with us, and I'm really excited for some of the information and insights they're about to share. Before we get into it, I just want to let everyone know that we have recently started or recently launched a group, a community of practice on LinkedIn around improving student outcomes. So if you're interested in joining that group, it's a closed group, but it is based on LinkedIn. Please just connect with me on LinkedIn, let me know, share your interest, and we'll add you to that group. Our hope is that throughout the academic year, we can start to gather insights of practice and what people are doing to be able to share some of that good practice and hopefully move this issue forward. Right, I would like to introduce our guest. So Alex Hensby is a senior lecturer in sociology from the University of Kent. Alex is a sociologist specializing in the study of social movements, race, and higher education, and is co-director for the Center for the Study of Social and Political Movements. He's the author of the books Participation and Non-Participation in Student Activism and Theorizing Global Studies, and is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Sociology. Between 2014 and 2022, Alex was the founding research lead, one of many researchers who established the University of Kent's Student Success Team, where he developed a program of research designed to inform policy and practice to help close its white, Black, Asian, minority ethnic awarding gap. He's currently working on a number of research projects that further develop these areas of interest, including the study of heritage activism in the United States post-Black Lives Matter community work and the history of identity politics. Great to have you with us, Alex.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Awesome. And Dr. Barbara Adewumi. She is a senior research fellow for the Student Success in the Center of the Study of Higher Education at University of Kent. Barbara was previously a lecturer in sociology and is a senior research fellow. Her research focuses on academic progression, closing the Black-white awarding gap specifically, increasing a sense of belonging and engagement for racially minoritized and widening participation students. Barbara's research interests include Black middle-class parents' aspirational strategies in education, decolonizing and diversifying the curricula, and critical race theory. Barbara is co-editor of Race, Capital and Equity in Higher Education, Challenging Differential Academic Attainment in UK Universities, published by Palgrave Macmillan. She's also a board member of the National Windrush Museum and is founder and co-chair of the Black Asian Minority Ethnic Staff Network, as well as UNESCO member for the preservation of cultural heritage through education. Great to have you with us, Barbara.
It's great to be here today, Nathan.
Awesome. So I just want to start with a bit of background, I guess somewhat in line with your bios. My initial question is just tell us a bit about yourself. And I guess what I like to ask is, how did you stumble into higher education? How did you find yourself working in this area around student success?
Okay, I'll start. But first, I just want to begin by sending out my sincere gratitude to all the co-authors who contributed to this book that we're going to talk about today, and to give special thanks to the commitment and patience of Student Success Team in producing the book. And of course, I give thanks to God and His grace in completion of this book. Okay, so how did I stumble into higher education? Well, really, it was because I decided to do a PhD after having 3 children. And usually it's the other way around, isn't it, really? But I had worked in the corporate world of marketing and sales for about 8 years and had a master's in contemporary Caribbean cultural history from Goldsmith College. And after having children, decided, okay, I'm going to go into teaching, and decided to actually start teaching in further education as a sociology lecturer.
Right.
And then when I decided to do my PhD, then naturally I did some teaching whilst doing my PhD at the University of Kent. So that's how I really came into teaching about cultural identity and race in the sociological aspects of race and identity in sociology. So that's really my story.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara. And Alex?
Yeah, so my PhD was actually about student activism, which then became the book that you mentioned earlier. And I was interested in the interplay, the relationship between social movements, social justice, and the role played by education institutions. And so my PhD was why some people chose to participate in student activism while at university and why some people did not. And that led me to think sociologically about the campus as a field of resources. This is not, university is not just about getting a degree, it's also about a whole range of experiences you have while at university. And I became increasingly aware of how, while you could be a student at university, accessing the campus and feeling an entitlement to play a full part in the university varied according to a range of different statuses. So, students with caring responsibilities, mature students who were commuting, and students who just didn't feel like they belonged to that kind of dominant campus culture. So it led me to be quite interested in those broader questions of whose university, for whom university really benefits. And so after my PhD, I took a postdoctoral position at the University of Kent, which was originally, it was a 2-year pilot project about the awarding gap. So that's how I came to get involved at the University of Kent with this research. But those sorts of areas of interest relating to my PhD was quite foundational for me.
Right. Okay. Awesome. You've somewhat helped answer my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So the book that you have recently released is Race, Capital, and Equity in Higher Education, and I've read it, and it's absolutely phenomenal, I would say, because it's a very thorough, for me, unpacking of a lot of pieces of research and evidence. And there's been many times that I've read things, and I've been doing research in this space for a while now, but very little times that I've actually come across something that's new or insightful. And there are certain, I think, key questions you begin to prod at and poke at that helps us to get a really contextualized understanding of the challenges ahead and what we need to think about it. And we're going to go into that and definitely unpack it. But what I want to ask is, why did you feel there was a need to write this book? What do you feel that the sector needed to take hold of from this book?
It's a good question. I suppose there's two aspects of my answer. One is that I think the sociological study of inequalities, education inequalities, has always privileged class, and class has been the sort of orthodoxy with race and ethnicity tacked on the end. And so I think that this project in this book has been really important for decentering class. And it's not to forget class. I think it's to really look at the dynamic interplay, the quite complex intersections between race and class. Because you've got aspects of privilege within race, but you've also got the experience of being racialized. So the ways in which those different sort of forms of social exclusion, discrimination, and privileging intersect. I think this book really wants to go deeply into that rather than keep these two areas of research and areas of experience quite separate. And the other is the sort of landscape of the attainment gap or the awarding gap that we encountered when the project was founded in 2014. And it was built into the way in which the project was originally constructed as a 2-year pilot study. And so me and a colleague, Lavinia Mitten at Kent, we were basically being asked to do some focus groups and then propose some interventions from those focus groups. And I think the implicit expectation was that we would somehow fix that problem, which is staggeringly naive looking back. I think, they wanted like a nice peer mentoring scheme that could just be a shiny thing for a couple of years and that would be it. And even though I'm obviously aware of my own positionality, I instinctively felt that this was not the right framing and that we really needed to get to the root of the issue. And I think what it reflects is the way in which a lot of this sort of awarding gap work presupposed a deficit framing. That if you look at an awarding gap, you look at the statistic that's lower and you think, well, here's the problem, what we need to do to upskill these people to remove this awarding gap, which doesn't involve looking at any of the ways in which the system and the institutions privilege those who are achieving higher. So this book chronicles, I suppose, quite a long period of time in which we started to really break out of that orthodoxy of privileging class and also posing a deficit way of thinking about the awarding gap.
Right. Fantastic. Barbara, what about yourself? What do you feel was needed to be conveyed? Because at the time, as you were saying, Alex, there was lots of different conversations. And I think you said 2014 you started this?
Yeah.
There was a very strong deficit narrative and almost a labeling. I remember when I first started to come across this in 2013, and it was very strong that it was a BME attainment gap. It was something to do with BME students and, their inability. I guess narratives fortunately have moved on to some extent. Barbara, what do you feel is missing from the conversation now in 2024, kind of 10 years on? What was it that you was trying to convey or wanted to get across with this book?
Yeah, well, I joined Student Success in 2019. So the Student Success team was, way on in terms of, interventions and, coming up with plans and ideas on how to tackle the awarding gaps. And I also found myself that, there were times when we were having conversations with staff and it was very much a deficit model, a deficit approach to students, that students were the ones that were the problem and we had to fix them. And I thought, well, this is not the right way to go about things. And through my PhD research, I actually looked at the Black middle class parents and their aspirations for their children. And so that, again, as Alex said, it was about looking at class as well as looking at race. And what I did was I decentered class and centered race using critical race theory. So I was coming in with a critical race theory approach. And this was fairly new to the Student Success team. They had some knowledge of it, particularly Alex had some knowledge of it. And I thought this was a particular missing from the conversations when I first joined, although critical race theory has now become more prominent in British research in education, which is great, thanks to authors like Nicola Rollop and David Gilbourne. And so what I felt was missing really was the complex intersections that we find with students who are racially minoritized. And many of these intersections with race, class, gender, with their socioeconomic position, these nuances remained untold. And so I thought that it's time to give the students a voice through our research in order to get staff and academia to understand where they were at in terms of how they felt about being targeted as a problem, when many students, Black students, had said to me, I'm not part of this dialogue, I'm not part of this conversation. I don't feel that I'm part of this awarding gap that they're talking about. I'm doing really well in education, I'm getting good grades. So there was this disconnection between people's understanding, lecturers' understanding and staff's understanding about the awarding gap. So that was the first hurdle we had to deal with, was to get lecturers to understand the data about awarding gap and what it actually means to their student cohort. And talking about student cohorts at the University of Kent, we have seen such a huge change in the diversity and the typology of the students at Kent over the last 10, even 15 years, where we have a lot of racially minoritized students at the University of Kent, probably over 50%. At our Medway campus, because we have two campuses, one at Medway and one at Canterbury. And Canterbury is moving fast also towards being nearly over 50% makeup of Black, Asian and other ethnic minority students. This is one of the reasons why I felt that we needed a more fresh and dynamic use of our research in order to bring the narratives to light and have the student voices centered more. And in the book, there's a chapter 10 about diversity mark, which talks about the student voice and the recognition of students as being co-creators of the curriculum and as agents of change. And this is really important part of the book and talking about equity in higher education, because it's giving students an opportunity to talk about how they feel about being in the center of higher education and being in the spotlight or in the lens of race. So really the purpose of the book is really to provide the context in all of this to the hope that we carry in our hearts, Alex and I, and also student success as a team to kind of liberate the minds of staff and students to create a more equitable learning space in higher education. So really, it's our attempt to use our research to dismantle inequities in the educational processes and in pedagogical practices, which we find can reproduce institutional whiteness in the curricula. So really the curricula and what's going on in the classroom, I pay particular attention to, because it relates very closely to degree outcomes.
I definitely got this sense, definitely as I was reading through it, there was the attempt to allow voice to come to the fore. And whereas I guess before in some, I guess, publications, it could either be about data or it could be about qualitative, but this really tried to show a picture of both sides. I think just thinking about what you were saying about, Barbara, about the demographic change in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, I came across a stat by Access HE who said, by 2030, student numbers are set to double, and that 74% of that growth will come from students from Black, Asian, minority, and ethnic backgrounds. And I get this sense of what's being conveyed is trying to let the sector know we can't do business as usual, that there's something that needs to happen or change or some kind of difference. What was interesting to me was this concept around academic capital. So I think in the book, you definitely unpacked kind of Bordeaux's kind of conversation around cultural capital, which featured prominently in the research quite in the early years, but actually academic capital I hadn't seen before, right? And you did point to some authors that had spoken about it. Can you just explain a bit more for our viewers or listeners, this concept of academic capital? What does that mean for students, I guess, in the modern day?
I suppose it's in effect an applied form of cultural capital, which you can see on two levels. One is specific to an institution, and one is more broadly to higher education. And I suppose also your degree program and the sort of specifics of how that's structured. But it's usually relating to some of the kind of tacit and hidden knowledges that are not necessarily just stated outright, but things that teachers might look for, how teachers might respond to certain students in a classroom. And then it's also about, how to be in a classroom, how to be in a lecture theatre. It's always important, we're at the start of a new academic year right now, how students walking into a lecture theatre for the first time find that a very overwhelming experience where there may not be any precedent. So there's a lot of kind of expectations of behaviour. There's a lot of implicit rules within most social institutions, but higher education and coming to the campus aged 18 or 19, a lot of it is about trying to decode a lot of these hidden rules and norms. And so those students who come to the university, especially whose parents have been to university, older siblings have been to university, they may have a stronger sense of what to expect and therefore can kind of seize the day and know what to look for. And I think there are students for whom there isn't such a family history of higher education or higher education in the UK. There's a lot of services and opportunities that you get at most UK campuses that students may not necessarily know are there. So there's an academic capital that comes from knowing what sort of support services are available, how they can improve, and then having the confidence to go and approach somebody and say, can you help me with this? I would like to use this or that. So that's a lot of the sort of tacit knowledge that we see. But I think one of the reasons why we wanted to take this concept further in the book was that a lot of academic capital or capitals in general had been studied around class, and that had focused particularly on access to elite institutions, Oxbridge, Russell Groups, ancient universities, and so on. And there's a corresponding kind of literature in the US as well with the Ivy League. And so the orthodoxy is about having to put your identity at the door and surrender yourself and assimilate to this very kind of cultured world. And for both of us, we didn't feel that spoke to most university experiences. So there's still this need for academic capital, but it's of a more ordinary kind, which is not about finding the room where you have sherry with the dean and take the Duke of Edinburgh award or these sorts of things. It might be about feeling comfortable to use the library. It might be about developing networks of friendship groups in your course that you can share textbooks, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we wanted to use it to think about the experiences of university once students were at university. And I think it also complemented the sort of ways in which we might think of microaffirmations as a counterpoint to microaggressions, as used extensively in critical race theory. So the ways in which somebody might be affirmed by their particular behavior, their knowledge within a classroom, and therefore have a bit of a halo effect for a teacher or for a cohort that I think becomes self-fulfilling because you feel more confident, you'll ask more questions, you can develop a sort of more personable relationship with your academics. And the absence of microaffirmations means that you just feel like I'm anonymous. And in an increasingly massified HE system, that feeling anonymous is quite disempowering. I think we wanted to really redraw academic capital to think about what are specifically racialized experiences or experiences of white privilege. And so that's why we're quite indebted to the concept of Black academic capital, also Black cultural capital. So Darren Wallace and Ali Megji and so on, thinking about the ways in which, as Barbara said earlier, students can be co-creators of a curriculum, but also challenge some of those curricular orthodoxies by asserting forms of Black cultural capital. That can be a way of gaining those microaffirmations while also changing the system from within. But that's not something that everybody has access to. So it's a term that it has been quite underused in academic research in higher education, and we're trying to draw it out and to really take more consideration to the specifics of race and ethnicity.
Yeah, and I think I definitely saw that, and it did get my mind racing because some of the research that I had seen previously showed that Black, Asian, particularly Black and Asian students who had come into higher education with BTEC qualifications actually were the least likely to succeed, right? And that was really interesting because some of the research talks about double disadvantage, that there's a disadvantage around race and ethnicity, but also around educational background. And for me, it felt like academic capital was speaking to that. There is a piece around ethnicity and race, but there's also a piece about, I think you showed in the table different proportions of ethnicities taking BTEC by gender and ethnicity. I guess my thought process is, to what extent do you feel we should take into account academic capital in what we're devising? Okay, let me rephrase it. I think I'm thinking of a bigger question because there's been lots of back and forths about whether we should change to better suit things like BTECs or whether BTECs need to align more with what happens at university. And so I guess my question is, to what extent do you think there needs to be this acknowledgement of different educational background in the mainstay of what we do?
I'll come in here. I think you really hit it on the head there about acknowledging the variety of qualifications students come in with, such as access. There's also the access qualification for mature students, as well as your traditional A-level students. And they're all in the same classroom, taught by the same lecturer. And what I have found in the research that I've been doing is that a lot of the lecturers do not have access or have knowledge about what it's like to be a BTEC student before you come into university, and what kind of skills have they gained from their BTEC courses. As you know, a lot of BTEC courses are based on coursework, redrafting and submitting your work to a point where it's reaching all the objectives. And so BTEC students have been used to that sort of, kind of pastoral as well as close guidance with their work. And then they come to university and they do not get that sort of guidance anymore. It's more about, well, you're going to have to do things more on your own and more independently. And lecturers do not understand how difficult that transition can actually be for some students. I mean, they can do it, they have the capability to do it, but they just need the right support. So there is a disjoint at the moment between higher education and lecturers and academics and professional services understanding of what makes up a BTEC student or what makes up an access mature student. And they're having to do research and hear their voices and their narratives in order to really understand and compassionately understand where they're coming from. And I think that's one of the missings, because you had asked that question earlier, and that's one of the missings in higher education. But some universities are beginning, to do that. But I think Kent is ahead of the curve in a sense. And the reason why I say that is because if we go back to how we work with students as co-creators of knowledge, in Diversity Mark, we employ students and we also train students to review reading lists and also the content of material that is taught across different disciplines at the University of Kent. And these Diversity Mark officers, as they're known, we have actually seen with our own eyes that they have developed high levels of academic capital and high levels of critical consciousness when they are doing this role as a Diversity Mark officer. And this is why we felt that in the book that we needed to emphasize academic capital and its importance now in higher education. Because as Alex says, they're coming from all different sorts of backgrounds. But with that comes skills, with that comes knowledge that a lot of us in higher education have not got. We never had access to that. So now we do have access to that by just giving them a platform and getting them to talk more about their knowledge and their Black cultural capital, for example, and how they're able to utilize it to a point where their critical consciousness can create really great collaborative work with staff. And I think that's where student success has done really well in showing a lot of schools across the institution at Kent that there's a lot of talent within these groups, and that mustn't be ignored.
So interesting, because in the book, I think it was table 3.3 or table 4 showed, I think it was Black students with BTECs had low increased worry or concern entering into higher education. And so that for me, that was the direct impact of that notion of academic capital and that what it could produce. And I guess what I'm hearing from you, Barbara, is acknowledging that students come in with that because of their academic capital then means we should be focused on how do we unlock their sense of academic capital, their sense of critical thinking, the ability to change things, the ability to get involved and participate. So it's different. On that note, because I think that was quite insightful, I think what you did really well in this book was to be able to convey how some of this theory actually quantifies. So I saw that Black BTEC came in with greater worry and concerns, but also you spoke about psychological need satisfaction and its impact on motivation. So just for the listeners, psychological need satisfaction looks at self-determination theory. There's 3 main components: perceived competence to do a task or to engage in a challenge, autonomy or the ability to feel like you've got a degree of freedom to do what you need to do to be successful, and relatedness, which kind of links to connectedness, potentially a sense of belonging. And a really interesting insight that I picked up from the book was that when perceived psychological need satisfaction of competence and relatedness came together, there was a link to that showing or demonstrating motivation for Black students. I hope I've got that correct. That when you saw that students had perceived competence and perceived relatedness, so the competence piece is, I guess, the academic capital. The relatedness piece is the sense of belonging, and this is how I'm conceptualizing it. Then intrinsic motivation was present. Did I capture that correctly?
Yes.
But then equally that and autonomy by itself, though, was linked to a motivation, so less motivation, where certain students were given just autonomy to do what they need to, especially for Black BTEC students, that was linked to negative motivation, which for me sounded like giving too much freedom without the guidance. Again, thinking about this concept of academic capital could actually make students feel less motivated. Did I get that correct as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, we should credit Stephen Earle, who wrote the chapter on motivation that I think you're quoting from, and we're indebted to his expertise. A sociology background is quite new to us, so he was great for bringing that framework into our thinking. and particularly how it complemented Bourdieu's theory of capitals, because actually what is missing, and this is perhaps where some of the deficit way of thinking comes from, that Bourdieu's theory is about accumulating capitals, and it can sometimes, you can see it as sometimes appearing to justify plugging away within an unequal, unjust system.
Yeah.
And that's not really what Bourdieu meant, but it's something that's sort of become in some sort of higher education policy, that the way of academic capital or cultural capital becomes a way of thinking about upskilling. You know, how can we make students more middle class? How can we make students more XYZ?
Right.
And what that does is strip students from their own agency and their own motivations for coming to university. And I think self-determination theory is really helpful for thinking about what it is that motivates a student to come to university, persist with university, and actually develop over time. And yeah, you're absolutely right that thinking about relatedness is important, particularly I think in the first year, for just feeling like you've got some sort of stake, some sort of foothold in university. And that's relatedness with teachers as well as fellow students.
Right.
And a sense of competence, yeah, it's related to a sense that you're kind of doing university right.
Yeah.
And that can be about academic capital. And part of what Barbara and I are saying is that we need to not make academic capital just this sort of box of traditional knowledges that everybody has to kind of reach that level. You know, it's something that we should actually rethink to be more inclusive, so the skill sets and the experiences, particularly with things like assessment that BTEC entrants have, we can furnish students with a greater sense of competence if we are validating some of the skills they come to university already with, rather than say, you know, we expect you to be like this, and we still assume that everyone's got A levels.
Yes. And actually in the book, there was a quote by a student that said, I think it was along the lines of, they went into a class and the lecturer said, you know, you would have all done this in A level. And that made them feel, you know, less capable or less, you know, I think he said, or she said, I'm questioning, should I be here? Am I supposed to be here? I think that's, yeah. So I caught that definitely in the quotes. Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that we can use some of the critical race theory concepts, that, you know, that's a microaggression in educational terms. And then when you consider the high proportion of, certainly at Kent, BAME students who come with BTEC, then that is a sort of, those two things can be quite corrosive and mutually reinforcing in creating a sense of unbelonging. But, you know, what we want to do in the book a lot is to really unpack this concept of the independent learner. And it becomes a bit of a catch-all term that staff use. And I've been guilty of this myself, I'm sure, of saying you need to be more independent. And particularly in the first year, you know, students are thrown in the deep end, but you're allowed to, because your first year may not contribute that much to your final degree result. But students kind of can be easily fobbed off and be told you should be getting on with this yourself. And so it comes back to what you're saying about autonomy, that too much autonomy without an understanding of how to use that and how to use that for yourself, that takes time to develop. And I think there's still an orthodoxy and assumption of the first year, which is to leave students to their own devices and they'll figure it out. And the fact is there are students who come with academic capital that is primed for university to then hit the ground running or to adapt and adjust far more quickly.
Yeah.
And that's good for them, great, fantastic.
Yeah.
But it means that we are also seeing particular groups of students take much more time to adjust to the university. And it's not fair if we're just kind of throwing them all in the deep end and then assuming.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, you should know this from A levels.
Yeah.
Something that might take some time to get over, to get back into sort of studying and feeling confident again.
I started to see that definitely in the quotes that were coming from students, because I think one student said, in our school or their sixth form, like every week there was conversation or sessions on UCAS and how to, I think it was kind of how to prepare for applying to Russell groups or whatever it may be. And that was weekly. So it was somewhat ingrained that this is the path you're going to take and this is what you need to know to do well in that environment. And then what we're saying is actually there's, you know, other students that have no sense of that. So that leads me on to my next question. What for you, and maybe from the book, but just in general, in your work in this space, has been some of the insights, things that have either surprised you or you just thought, oh, that's really insightful, from doing this work?
I think for me, discussions we've had about the causes of the awarding gap have really been surprising at times, where you found various people to be quite biased against particular types of students, as we've talked about, students who come from a different range of backgrounds. And I think what's happened really is that the research that we've been doing, particularly what I've been doing recently, has helped me to really understand where people are at on this spectrum of understanding of awarding gaps. And I think student success work has been difficult at times, where we've got some great ideas and initiatives and interventions that we would like to put into schools. However, sometimes it feels like we're kind of swimming through treacle and the pace is very slow. And a lot of the EDI work that we do actually gets deprioritized rather than moving up the agenda. So when we think, okay, we're getting somewhere here, actually, we're not. And that was a surprise for me, coming into student success and coming into higher education, because I was under the impression that we want everyone to do well in higher education and get a good degree. But what surprised me was that some people were focusing on particular types of students who were more independent in their learning, or who were more autonomous, or who were more motivated, and they weren't paying attention to those who were less engaged, or those who are really quiet, who tend to fall through the cracks. So they have the ability to get a 2-1, but they end up getting a 2-2 because they're not really paid attention to. So to me, that was surprising. For example, I think the work that we've been doing and the work that Student Success have been doing is to encourage students, particularly students from widening participation backgrounds or racially minoritized students, to get involved with the work that we have been doing in Student Success. And that has created a kind of interest across schools about how students can actually be quite autonomous in their decision making, and they can actually join things like steering groups or decision making boards, which is great. So we've also employed diversity mark officers to be part of focus groups or to participate in our own research, which is great. We've also employed research interns to develop their own research skills, and they very much influence how we do our research and understand their lived experience in higher education, because they are there and they are studying at the University of Kent and working with us alongside us at the University of Kent. And so that has revealed a lot of things that we didn't know about students in terms of their competencies, in terms of their relatedness, in terms of their belongingness. When we think, okay, we're doing okay with belongingness because we've done inspirational talks where we've gotten people to come in who look like them to talk about, how successful they are in their professions. But then when we get the feedback, we still find that implicitly they believe that the university is still very white and the curricula is still very Eurocentric. So we're beginning to work even more closely with students, collaboratively, to really understand, why do they have this sense of belongingness? Why do they have this sense of lack of confidence? What is this thing that kind of doesn't allow them to use their academic capital or build that confidence? So I would say that we've done a lot to support students, because we found out these little nuggets and nuances about them, which has helped us to kind of support them in other ways. Like, for example, you might already know this, but the University of Kent had a movement called Decolonise the University with the Kent Law School. And that was a huge success in that students were able to create a manifesto about things like the curricula, about belongingness, and where they felt the status quo needed to be challenged, and student success were able to support in different ways with that. Yeah, so I think those sorts of things have helped us to really understand some of the missing links with students and staff.
And just, I realised just before I ask you, Alex, about kind of key insights or surprises, Barbara, just for those listening, could you just give a brief overview of the Diversity Mark initiative? Because I realise we're talking about it as if everyone knows about it.
Yeah, sure. Just briefly, Diversity Mark is an award-winning program that employs students from widening participation backgrounds and racially minoritized students mainly to review reading lists on different modules across different disciplines at the University of Kent. And they work alongside conveners who design their modules and decide what goes on the reading list. And what they found, Diversity Mark officers found that the reading lists were predominantly Eurocentric, where maybe 80 to 90% of the reading lists were very white, male, middle-class authorship, and very little was on or from global South authors. And if they were, they tended to be additional reading or suggested reading rather than core reading, which is embedded within the actual teaching of the module. And so Diversity Mark officers work alongside the conveners to find ways of embedding global authorship, to find ways of helping the lecturer become more culturally sensitive to the students who are in the classroom, because as I said, it's quite a diverse cohort in some of the modules that are taught across disciplines. And so Diversity Mark officers use their knowledge and their critical consciousness to really challenge some of these conveners about their positionality and about their pedagogical practices and whether they're fair, equitable, and inclusive. So that's kind of a short version of Diversity Mark entails. And conveners at the end win awards, a Diversity Mark award, to say that they have certified their reading list and their lecture content, as well as lecture slides as well, and assessments or the wording of their assignments to make them more culturally sensitive and engaging to all students.
Really interesting. Thank you for that, Barbara. Sorry, Alex, I'll come to you. What's been the kind of key insight or surprising factors that you've come across in your work in this area?
I suppose, I mean, this is something that I'm toying with in my head right now, really, is thinking, it's sort of going back to my sort of training as a social movement scholar, that so much of the way in which we do equality work and the way we try and genuinely bring equity into higher education is quite similar to a social movement. And I think back to when I started working at Kent and we did our first sort of, I wrote some literature summary digest to a bunch of staff at various levels. And I remember one person just couldn't say the word black, a white lecturer. And I think that realizing just how much the idea of a post-racial society had taken hold, but then knowing also that something wasn't quite right as well, but not really having the language or any kind of knowledge frame to make sense of it. There was just this impotence of being able to talk openly about race and racial injustice and racism. And I think over the course of this 10-year period, I am pleased to see that a lot of advances have been made. I mean, clearly nowhere near enough, but I think looking at there have been these kind of opportunity structures that have come up at various points in the last 10 years, which have been able to advance our institutional response to these issues. And certainly the student success team has been great for that, but we've been able to capitalize on certain things that have happened. And I think the Roads Must Fall movement, which has initiated a number of decolonize campaigns from a range of different universities, including at Kent, and the Black Lives Matter movement as well, and seeing that students being empowered and expecting an institutional response to these issues and starting to apply it not just to the initial Black Lives Matter movement, thinking about police brutality in the United States, but now thinking about the production of knowledge, thinking about curricula. thinking about representation of Black professors in UK universities. And I mean, it's depressing and cynical, but I think the institutional risk that universities feel in these moments can really be used and exploited to actually kind of advance, to really kind of roll a six in terms of advancing racial equity, because prior to that, the sorts of where this project came from, there's always a tendency to go with the interventions that are the low-hanging fruit, the easy wins, the things that are a bit cosmetic but aren't really engaging structurally. And there's also a tendency, and Sarah Ahmed writes about this extensively, the doing the document instead of doing the doing. So this kind of bureaucratic performance of equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And that can feel extremely frustrating. But then there are these moments that happen where we can actually really catalyze something and more can be changed. But it remains fickle. And we can see, and we may look at the landscape now and think, is that door starting to close again? And is it gonna be a struggle again for a few years to try and really push for the kinds of programs and initiatives and rethinking that we're looking for? So it's really good that student success is here, and over the course of 10 years, it's become a permanent fixture in the university, which is a massive change from the tendency of EDI to be something that's people working on short-term contracts and work that sort of the contract runs out before the recommendations ever get implemented. So we're sticking around, and that's really important, but we are still to some extent waiting to make the most of opportunities that come our way when institutions like universities recognize that there's a wider context that should force them into thinking much more self-critically about their practice.
It's so interesting, because I guess what I'm hearing you say, it's almost like a feign of progress, that there is progress, but the extent that progress is happening, or at the speed that it's happening, is slower than we would think, especially with so much research and evidence. And, with this book, there's been a lot there really dissected. And I think one of the challenges that I picked up from the last chapter of the book was the challenge of now taking this really insightful kind of research and evidence and theory and making it widespread in what the university does day to day across the whole institution, right? So my question is going to be, how can people who are listening to this practically think about spreading good practice, right? We're in an era at the moment of lots of new access and participation plans, really long documents, and you talk about, documentation and not doing. And now we're at the kind of precipice of, okay, with this wave of access participation plans, we need to see implementation. And that might be a catalyst for engagement with some of this authorship. But you're right, there has always been this barrier. And I think it's a bit wider than university. It's the relationship with Britain and race, right? That has been there kind of since forever. But I guess practically, what would be some of the things you would want people to think about in practically implementing interventions across the institution?
Okay, I think that's a really good question, looking into the future of all of this. I think collaboration with students as co-creators is key to moving recommendations forward, because as you said, there are reams of documents with lots and lots of recommendations. There is the Race Equality Charter that many universities have applied to, like ourselves. And then they're going to receive a race action plan with more recommendations on how to improve belongingness and closing the awarding gaps, for example, and just, creating a culture that's more compassionate in universities. You can't do that without the help of the students and the student voice. So that needs to be really centered in all that we do in the future of higher education. And I think we also need to think about the key stakeholders who hold the power ultimately to make key decisions But it's not only the people at the top, which is what I found, because I have been able to speak to the executive group, to the VC, who think, okay, that's a great idea, let's run with it, but then there's a stumbling block, which tends to be the more conservatism of middle management, who say, well, we haven't got the resources, I haven't got the staff to do that. Where do we start? They tend to be more of the obstacle, I find, in moving the recommendations forward. So what we need, I think, is a cultural shift within institutions, across the institution, because you have pockets of schools who do stuff that's really good in terms of EDI, and are moving forward. And then you have other schools who have a different sort of management thinking, and things don't move as fast. So what we need is kind of like a community of best practice that can, convey the message that you can do this in your school. This is something that you can actually change. And this is how we did it. So you need more positive messages to go across the institution so that you build the faith in social justice and equity. And so I think that's a really important way of telling practitioners out there that not to lose the faith, but to create these communities of practice where you can collate all the good practice that is going on, because there is a lot of good things that are going on, and to use that as kind of a way of steering people to kind of shift their thinking about equity and race in higher education.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. That somewhat a bottom-up approach of, getting this galvanized, even if it's pockets of good practice, but being able then to share that, to communicate what are we doing, what are we seeing, really powerful. And Alex, what's your thoughts?
Well, I echo what Barbara says, of course, and I think one of the necessary things that all universities can do is to invest long term in groups and networks and institutions within the university. Student success has been a great beneficiary of the fact that it's been turned from a project to a permanent fixture in the university. And there are various points in time where universities may have a lot of money to throw at progressive projects. And suddenly you're swimming around with, resources are available. But what is more important is the long-term commitment. It's to make those sorts of groups and networks that come out of those opportunities embedded into what universities do, so that racial justice, racial equity is not just a sort of project that pops up. Yes, to some extent, we're always going to be responsive to broader opportunities and things that happen outside of the university, but having skilled people who have that sort of institutional memory to then respond to those opportunities and do something really meaningful with it, I think is really important. Because if everybody's on short-term contracts and if everything is too transient, there's a tendency to reinvent the wheel, that you have a report 6 years after the last one that makes exactly the same recommendations and gets put in the same drawer as the last one. And if there isn't that sort of institutional memory with these sorts of initiatives, these sorts of institutions, then it can very easily just fall into the same cycle where only cosmetic change is made. And to some extent, we as staff have been quite responsive to what students have done. And we recognize that students go off and graduate. It's the constant flux, the constant cycle. And, Barbara's played an active role in the BAME staff network, for example. And that's about embedding and institutionalizing what lessons have been learned over a long period of time. Of course, it can be a lot of work, and that needs to be properly recognized and as time that academics take to do that work. And it's not a hobby,
Right.
But that is a way of building that knowledge and that memory of what worked, what's been done before, what can be done again, rather than the problem of reinventing the wheel, because everything is seen in terms of these miniature projects.
Yes, I agree. It's about the pop-up nature of we're going to just do this rather than we're going to embed this into what we do. And I guess what you was alluding to is workload it, because it's real work. When you're talking about some of this stuff, you'd bring in consultants to do culture change, work that takes years to happen and see. And yet sometimes EDI is seen as an add-on, as that other thing that gets done. Okay, where I want to kind of finish, and this has been fascinating for me, so thank you both. You may not attest to this, but I had a look at some of your data at Kent, and I saw that during the period of, I think, 2015 onwards, there has been a reduction in your completion gap, quite a big reduction actually, in terms of ethnicity. In as much as it's narrowed completion-wise, if you're Black, Asian, minority ethnic, or white, it's more or less similar completion rates. I infer that some of your work has contributed to that. I won't say, everything that I guess you've both done has made it happen, but I guess my question is, and when we look at the attainment piece, there are still disparities, right? Not thinking about your institution, just thinking about the sector as a whole, what one thing do you think we need to do in order to address the degree awarding gap, the attainment gap? One thing that we actually need to do. And I'll start off because I know it's a big question, so I'll kick off. In my viewpoint, I think there has to be an acknowledgement of race in this conversation, which often isn't. It might be acknowledged, but maybe superficially. But what I'm talking about is a real understanding of what I call racialized realities of learning, of higher education. And I think sometimes I talk like that and people switch off, but I think we have to have really thorough conversations about race and how it impacts the learning experience in different settings and so forth. So that's my viewpoint. But I just want to capture from you what you feel is a critical either conversation to have or thing to do in order to move things forward on that degree awarding gap.
Alex, you want to go first?
Well, that is a very big question, Nathan. I think, there are so many different things. I think for me, and maybe it just speaks more to a particular point of interest I have, because I'm, worked on this project for 8 years, and I'm now, I still work with Barbara at some of our projects, but I'm also teaching, I teach sociology, and one of the things that I'm always conscious of is the sort of difficulty of staff-student relationships, staff-student interactions. And as the universities become more professionalized and specialized, which of course is a good thing, the ability to have meaningful conversations between staff and students has become a bit more difficult, because the roles that we have, it's very important that we're not providing counseling services and things that people are actually paid to do as experts. But then the role of the academic, it can be harder to know what's going on in students' lives. And I think it's very easy for academics to think, well, that's just one less problem I have to deal with. That if the student isn't knocking on my door, then I can just get on with the real work I'm doing. And I think one thing I would really love to see is more investment, both in a policy level, but also just in a personal level, of staff checking in on students. When we talked earlier about microaffirmations, I think being recognized in the classroom, Barbara said about, the quiet ones in the classroom, the ones that may not have felt that they were being recognized, being validated and being in that room. And I try and bring that into my practice. I don't do well enough, but I don't think anyone does really, is to be attentive to students. And it's harder in this massified environment. We're not talking about small cohorts anymore. But I think it's a responsibility of academic staff to reach out and connect with students and be available to students, because I think that's something that, regardless of whatever documentation that we might be putting forward, whatever recommendations, whatever, Kent 2030 style, rebrands or whatever, engaging meaningfully with our students is one thing that we all can do, and it's one thing we all should do.
Heart of pedagogy, as it's put, definitely. Barbara.
Wow, I was of similar thinking actually, because I also have taught students for many years, and I come from a background where I didn't go to a prestigious school or university. I went to further education to gain my A level, so I didn't go through the traditional route. So I kind of used that to build a relationship with a lot of my students when I was teaching. So I think the discourse that we have around access and inclusivity lacks a sincere moral footing, and there is a need for more courageous conversations about race and about to help us combat the issues of reproduction of whiteness in academia, because we all know it's still very much entrenched in the academy. So we need to be really realistic about our sensitivities towards students. And there's a chapter that's in the book that Dr. Bridget Nagandu, my esteemed in the social work department, and myself wrote about negotiating race as Black lecturers in the University of Kent. And we talk about very similar things that Alex has just talked about: getting to know your students, building that relationship, and giving them micro affirmations, when it is supposed to be given. And that does so much to help a student's confidence and build their academic capital, for example. Very small things mean a lot to students now, rather than just saying, okay, we have this workshop for you to, or a skills workshop for you to attend. It's going to help you increase your grades. Students are looking for more than that from their lecturers. They're looking for compassion. They're looking for understanding. They're looking for being more culturally sensitive towards them, because they are, after all, human beings who are coming from different social backgrounds, and they need that sort of support now more than ever, because life is tough out there for students. We're finding now in lots of our research that students are having to work part-time, a lot of part-time hours in order to survive in higher education. Do we actually understand what is behind all of that? But some of the research that we're doing now looks into that much more deeply than your regular lecturer that stands in front of the classroom, so that's the sort of research that we're doing, because we know that students are kind of making a call out saying, here, listen to us, listen to who we are as a person. And that way you begin to understand our struggles and our battles and our achievements in towards closing the awarding gap.
Great stuff. I want to say thank you both for taking out the time, sharing with us Race, Capital and Equity in Higher Education. I believe you can access it through Amazon. Is it in stores? What's the best place for people to capture?
Well, it is open access. It is free to download the Palgrave Macmillan website. So
right,
yeah.
So we'll put the link below. Do have an access to that book, share it with colleagues, have discussions about key chapters, and let's move this throughout the whole sector. Thank you, both of you, and thank you everyone for listening.